The town lay beneath a sky the color of washed bone, pressing down hard as though the weight of heaven itself had decided to test the rooftops. Shingles rattled in the breeze, tin edges clattered against themselves, and the air carried the smell of dust baked into wood. Across the main street, nothing moved except the wind, shifting sheets of grit that scraped low against barrels and scuffed along porch steps. A saloon sign dangled crooked on its chain, clicking each time the breeze shoved it. She stood alone on the mercantile porch, arms locked across her chest, her frame rigid against something heavier than heat. Months of solitude had carved a sharpness into her stance. On the edge of town, she occupied a cabin not hers by deed, but hers by necessity, hers by grit, hers because there was nowhere else left. She kept her life together with scraps, sewing patches into trousers, hammering tin onto leaking roofs, washing shirts for the few ranch hands who hadn't ridden on. Her husband had traded their land deed for whiskey, then vanished into desert silence, leaving her name shackled to debt she hadn't chosen. Every time she stepped into town, she felt eyes follow her. Some judged, some pitied, some hunted. She moved as if balancing on glass. Women whispered she carried bad luck. Men wondered aloud what liberties could be taken with a woman left unguarded. She survived by keeping her edges visible, walking as if she were steel drawn into the light. Anything softer drew trouble. That morning, when a figure appeared at the far end of the road, her breath shortened. Strangers never meant peace. They carried burdens, demands, danger. The rider moved slow, slouched forward in the saddle. His hat brim cut shadows across his face, hiding him in half dark. The horse beneath him looked worn thin, ribs showing under a hide slick with travel sweat. The closer he drew, the more it seemed the town itself held its breath, waiting to see what shadow came trailing behind. He wasn't the kind tethered to ranch lines and steady wages. His beard grew uneven, dust clung to his coat, and the revolver at his hip rode low and worn. He dismounted at the pump with the stiffness of a man who'd carried himself too far without rest. His silence didn't strike her as shyness. It was the silence of someone who had learned that speaking first too often brought regret. Before he reached for water, she stepped forward. The knot in her stomach twisted, but she disguised it in barbed words. "Cowboy," she called, voice cutting across the still street. "Is your mind always crawling where it doesn't belong? That's the only reason a man looks so lost." The sentence surprised even her, tumbling out sharp as glass. A warning, a test, a plea buried beneath. "Don't treat me like the others. Don't make me defend myself again." Her body tensed, ready to catch his sneer, his laugh, his swagger forward. Fingers twitched near the knife hidden under her belt. If he proved like the rest, she would leave before his shadow reached her. But he didn't. He lowered his eyes to the pump, gripped the handle, and worked until water spilled fresh into the bucket. Then he lifted it toward her. Not a grin, not an insult, just a gesture plain as daylight. For a moment her chest eased, though her guard held fast. She drank with measured sips, still watching him as though any second he might shift into the familiar danger. The wind kicked, and he shrugged off his coat. He laid it across her shoulders with the matter-of-factness of someone used to sharing against the elements. Pride almost made her refuse, but cold bit through the desert air even in midday. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see gratitude as weakness, but inside she felt something unexpected. A flicker of empathy for a man who looked more battered than threatening. He didn't linger near. He didn't press. He only stood there, hands easy, eyes restless, as if always scanning for something unseen. And she knew then he hadn't come to town simply for water. Men like him drifted in only when there were no roads left to follow. Her mission was survival. Keep the cabin from falling, guard what little food she scraped, fight off whoever tried to take the last of it. His was movement. Keep going until ground stopped rejecting him. And as they stood in the dust-heavy silence, both worn in different ways, it was clear neither had much left to lose. She let the stillness stretch, then jerked her chin toward the dirt trail running out of town. "If you're after a place to sit the night, follow." The words landed flat, but not unkind. He considered, jaw tightening, eyes shifting briefly toward the saloon rail where two men leaned, watching too close. Their eyes tracked her, measuring what she might do with the drifter. The stranger gave them no satisfaction. He only adjusted his reins and fell into step behind her. The choice weighed heavy in him. He could ride on, collapse beneath open sky, wake emptier than before. Or he could follow this woman who cut sharp but hadn't turned away. For a man bone-weary from moving, the second option felt less weakness, more chance to breathe. The walk to her place passed wordless, but not without tension. She checked behind them often, shoulders set stiff with old memories of being followed home. He didn't question. He understood. When the cabin came into sight, her life stood plain. The frame sagged eastward, wood silvered and weathered. Tin sheets rattled loose where storms had chewed at the roof. A fence slouched broken, the well rope split to threads, a chicken coop without a door. She halted at the porch, arms locked across her chest, bracing for whatever judgment he might give. Too many men measured her by the wreckage left behind, not by what she had kept alive. But he walked past her, set his hand on the door, pressed against the hinge, then crouched low. From his bag he pulled wire and a bent nail and set to work. His movements carried the calm of practice. Not the first broken door he had steadied. She stood in the threshold, brows drawn, arms tight, but her eyes softened against her will. For months she had braced for men who came to tear down what little remained. Watching one put it back together was a strange kind of disarmament. The hinge caught. The door swung smoother than it had in months. "Better," he said, voice low from disuse. She swallowed hard, torn between relief and the fear of showing it. Gratitude had cost her before. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and boiled coffee. A table scarred with knife lines sat near the wall. A narrow bed shoved to the corner wore a quilt patched beyond recognition. Shelves carried jars that nearly echoed with emptiness. Beans. A scrape of flour. Coffee ground thin, her jaw set. Shame pressed sharp into pride. "It's all I've got left," she said flat, as if daring him to sneer. He shook his head once. Not pity, not judgment. Understanding, plain. And that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Night drew down. Coyotes howled beyond the fence line. She told him he could take the porch. He nodded, unrolled his saddle by the wall, and sat with the stillness of someone who had learned how to wait. She closed the door, latched it but didn't bolt, caught between distrust and something close to reliance. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the wind pressed her nerves. She told herself she had only let him follow because she needed a hinge fixed. But another truth gnawed. Something in his silence felt different. Outside, he walked the fence once, scanning for prints, then returned to the porch and settled with rifle laid across his knees. He wasn't here by luck. His debts chased him close, his horse near collapse, his choices thin. Yet he sat steady, watching the horizon not for himself but for the cabin behind him. When dawn broke pale, she stepped out. He sat where he had been, hat brim low. "You didn't rest," she said, voice low. "Didn't need to." His voice came rough but steady. Something in his restraint loosened the knot in her chest. She wanted to ask why he stayed, why he hadn't pressed for more, why he hadn't pried into her past. She wanted to know what shadows made him carry silence like armor, but she held her tongue. He didn't ask her questions either. For now, that was enough. The days that followed drew themselves into a rhythm, though neither would name it out loud. At first, silence stretched tight between them, each step measured. But slowly, in the way of dust settling after wind, the silence softened, becoming space rather than tension. He rose early, the kind of early men learned when work didn't wait. Before light had fully bled across the ridge, he hauled water from the pump, checked his horse's hooves, scanned the fence line. His motions were steady, shaped by years of habit. She watched from the doorway, arms folded, caught between the unease of letting a stranger move so freely and the relief of having work done without asking. Inside, she stretched food thin. Oats cooked down until broth nearly showed the bottom. Beans boiled in water so light it couldn't rightly be called stew. Still, she divided what little she had. When she ladled half into another bowl and set it before him, his only response was a nod. No complaint. No grumble. He ate with shoulders squared, spoon moving unhurried like a man who knew hunger too well to insult it. That unsettled her more than if he had asked for more. Most men who drifted through pressed their advantage quick, demanded, leaned, took until you fought them off or lost what you had. But he measured himself carefully, like someone used to fitting where he didn't belong. By mid-morning he was at the fence. He studied the leaning rails, the shallow posts, the places where storms had dragged earth away. "Won't stand through another blow," he muttered. She stiffened, bracing for the question that always followed. What would she pay him for his time, what he expected in return? But instead he added, "Cottonwood grows down the wash. Straight enough for rails. I'll cut them." The offer caught her wrong-footed. He hadn't asked for coin or food or anything. Just said what could be done, as though the fence mattered to him too. She narrowed her eyes, trying to see what lay behind it. But nothing came. No smirk, no wink, no reaching hand. Finally, she gave the smallest nod. "You do that, maybe I'll stretch supper beyond beans." That was all the agreement they needed. He worked with the steadiness of a man who had built and rebuilt too many things. Sweat ran down his back, but his pace didn't falter. She scavenged boards from the collapsed shed, patching the chicken coop with hands blistered raw. They worked near each other without speaking much. The quiet between them wasn't sharp anymore. It was the kind of silence that let them breathe. When he came back from the wash with shoulders damp and a bundle of rails, she handed him a tin cup of water. He drank careful, not spilling a drop, then set the cup back without comment. She studied him, noting scars along his arm, pale lines of old burns or cuts. She wanted to ask where they came from, what fights had carved them into him, but her throat tightened. Knowing too much could remind her of men before, the ones who carried stories like blades hidden in their coats. She wasn't sure she wanted that truth. That night she asked only one question, voice flat but curious despite herself. "Why stop here, of all places?" He set his spoon down, looked at her long. Horse was wearing thin. Couldn't push him further. His jaw tightened. "And I've been moving long enough." She heard what he didn't say. The ghosts, the debts, the endless road. She gave a faint nod. For the first time in years, she thought maybe she wasn't the only one who had nowhere else to go. The next morning, she cinched her shawl tight and said, "We ride into town together." Her stomach knotted as she spoke it. She hadn't walked into town alongside a man since her husband left, and she knew what tongues would do with it. But sending the stranger in alone with her list seemed worse. They would cheat him blind or whisper louder behind her back. At least riding in beside him, she could keep her eyes open. He didn't argue, just nodded once, though his silence said he understood the weight of it. He had seen how the saloon men looked at her, the way their gazes sharpened when she passed. The road into town rattled with hoofbeats. She sat straight, chin lifted, though inside her stomach twisted. She thought of the storekeeper's wife, of neighbors who already treated her like a shadow. She hated to hand them gossip, but she hated more the thought of walking in alone with debts heavy in her shawl. As they entered the main street, heads turned. The same two men leaned on the saloon rail, smirks spreading as if they owned the right to judge. Their talk cut off, their eyes crawling over her before landing on him. She held her gaze forward, refusing them any satisfaction. Inside the store, the air smelled of dust and kerosene. The clerk looked at her first, then at him, pausing like a man adding numbers. She set the list on the counter: flour, salt, lamp oil, nails. After a hesitation, she added, "Glass." The clerk raised a brow, eyes sliding toward the cowboy as if to say, "So another man's paying now?" Heat flushed her face, shame pressing against her pride. But before she could speak, the cowboy reached into his saddlebag, laid down coins, fewer than hers, but enough to split the burden. She stared at him, caught off guard. She had expected him to let her carry it, maybe even step aside.
Instead, he chose to share it.
Not a word spoken. The supplies came wrapped in rough paper and twine. He lifted them without being asked, carried them out under the watching eyes of town. The saloon men stepped off the rail, one spitting in the dust. "Didn't think you'd bring him home so quick," he called, voice sharp with suggestion. She froze, a heartbeat fury rushing her throat. Her instinct was to spit back words sharp enough to draw blood. But before she could, the cowboy stepped closer, eyes steady on his horse. He didn't look at the men. Didn't answer. His silence carried heavier than any insult. She understood then. He wasn't the kind to feed talk. His quiet was weight. It steadied her. Together they walked past, dust rising at their heels. At the cabin, he set the bundles down, then crouched to frame the new glass in the window. With a strip of cloth in the edge of his knife, he fitted it snug so it wouldn't rattle. She unpacked the rest: nails, lamp oil, flour. Each small thing felt like a step toward the cabin, standing stronger. But peace didn't linger long. A rider appeared 2 evenings later, his horse well-fed, saddle polished, spurs shining. He sat tall, confidence dripping from him like oil. She stepped onto the porch, chest tightening as soon as she saw him. The cowboy moved from the fence, not yet reaching for his rifle but already measuring distance, speed, outcomes. The rider tipped his hat with a smile too wide to mean respect. "Afternoon, ma'am. I'll keep it brief." He pulled a folded paper from his vest and tossed it onto the porch. "Your husband signed this lien years back. Cabin and ground belong to the man I ride for. Time's up." Her stomach churned, old shame rising like bile. She picked the paper up, hands trembling though her face stayed steel. The signature looked real, but details were missing. No seal, no stamp, no witnesses. "He's dead," she said flat. "If your man wants to collect, he'll have to dig him out of the desert." The rider smirked. "We don't dig, we burn. If you're not gone by week's end, fire will settle it." Before she could answer, the cowboy stepped forward. His voice carried low even, the kind that forced men to listen. "Paper's worthless. No seal, no county mark. Just a drunk's scratch. Any judge would laugh you out." The rider turned his gaze, sizing him up. The silence stretched thin like the second before a draw, but the cowboy didn't twitch, didn't blink, just stood steady. That steadiness unsettled the rider more than any threat. With a click of his reins, he spat and turned, his horse riding off in a cloud of dust. Her knees weakened, though she refused to show it. She crushed the paper in her grip. "They'll come back," she said, voice sharp but cracking beneath. "Men like that never leave it alone." The cowboy took the paper, folded it, tucked it under a kettle inside where wind couldn't steal it. "Then we'll be ready. No promises. No soft lies. Just truth." The storm came 2 nights later. By afternoon, the sky had grown black over the western ridge, heavy clouds rolling like beasts. The air pressed thick, the kind that made lungs tighten before rain even fell. He stood in the yard, jaw set. "Storm's coming," he said. She already knew. She dragged jars from shelves, set them low. He climbed to the roof, hammering tin sheets down with wire and nails. Each strike rang sharp across the valley, chased by rising wind. By dusk, rain slapped hard against the earth, fat drops turning dust to mud in seconds. Wind howled, rattling walls, shaking the door in its frame. Her heart pounded, old memories clawing up. The sound of fists against wood, the weight of rage battering her door. She braced herself against it, chest heaving. This storm wasn't a man, but her body remembered too much. He came down soaked, eyes narrowed against the rain. Together they shoved the table against the window. "Lantern low," he said. She lit it dim, flame shuddering in the glass. The storm roared. Water bled through seams in the roof, dripping into pans she shoved beneath. When a rail snapped in the corral with a sound like gunfire, she flinched. He grabbed his rifle, lantern, and pushed out into the gale. She pressed the doorframe, breath locked, watching his shadow fight the storm. For a moment she thought he wouldn't come back. But then he returned, soaked through, voice steady. Horses calm, fence held. They sat across from each other at the scarred table, the storm screaming around them. He kept the rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the door. She wrapped her hands around a cup of water she didn't drink, gaze pinned to the lantern flame. The silence between them was no longer fear. It was endurance shared. 2 people against the storm. By dawn, the wind had died. The cabin stood scarred but whole. The corral still upright, the roof battered but holding. She stepped out into gray light, mud sucking at her boots. For the first time in years, she felt something that might have been victory, not because the storm had passed, it always passed, but because she hadn't stood through it alone. When she looked at him, water dripping from his hat brim, exhaustion plain, he gave her a small nod. She returned it. No words needed. The thought was the same. If we can outlast this, maybe we can outlast what else comes. The morning after the storm broke clean and sharp. The sky was washed pale, as if scrubbed by the night's rage, and the air carried that rare sweetness the land sometimes gave after being beaten down. She stepped out barefoot onto the porch, wood damp beneath her toes, and let herself breathe deeper than she had in months. The cabin had held. The boards groaned but hadn't given. The fence still marked the line. For the first time, she didn't see the place as something collapsing, but as something that could be kept. He came around from the corral leading his horse, reins loose in his hand. The animal's flank steamed, but its ribs no longer showed so sharp. The barley from town was already filling it out. He patted its neck, tied it with a knot meant to hold, and looked up at her. For the first time since he'd arrived, his mouth bent toward something like a smile. Not wide, not carefree, just a flicker of ease that looked real. By midday, dust rose from another rider's trail. This time it was the marshal. He dismounted slow, boots sinking in softened ground, his presence heavy with years of settling disputes. He didn't come with paper or weapon drawn, just the plain weight of authority earned the hard way. He read the folded lien she handed him, lips moving as he traced each line. Then he tapped it against his palm and shook his head. Worthless. No county seal. No witness. No record in my books. Relief pressed against her ribs but didn't yet loosen. But they'll be back. They always come back. The marshal leaned against the rail, jaw set. That'd be Rollins' doing. He's been pulling tricks like this for years, selling false claims, waving drunken scratches. Keeps his hands clean by sending hired riders to rattle folks. Her stomach twisted. So he gets away with it? The marshal's eyes sharpened. Not this time. Word's already reached me he tried the same trick on a cattle buyer up north. That buyer's pressing charges. Rollins will be standing in front of a judge before long, and likely won't walk free after. He folded the paper once more, then handed it back. Until then, I can't promise he won't send more boys. But I can tell you this. Your hold on this cabin is stronger than his lie. It wasn't comfort, not exactly. But it was truth, and truth was something she had been starved for. When the marshal mounted and tipped his hat, she stood straighter. For the first time in years, she could say it aloud, even if only to herself. This ground is mine. That night, the cowboy sat at the table cleaning his rifle by lantern glow. She watched him in silence, wondering why he stayed. Why he hadn't moved on after fixing her hinge, her fence, her storm-worn roof. Why he hadn't taken the coin she owed him in meals and vanished. Questions pressed at her chest, but she swallowed them back. Instead, she poured the last of the coffee, weak as water, and set it before him. He nodded once. It was enough. For listeners outside the story, the neighbors, the town, anyone who gossiped, the question would be simple. Why hadn't she folded? Why hadn't she left with what little she had before men with claims or storms or hunger swallowed her whole? The answer lay in the scars no one saw, in the tight set of her jaw, and the fact that she'd been chaste enough in her life. This patch of dirt, cracked as it was the last thing she could still call hers. And now, with him steady beside her, she thought maybe it was worth fighting for. The days that followed carried a rhythm different from the ones before. He worked at the livery in town part-time, earning honest coin with his hands instead of debts at his heels. She traded her washing for hens, their soft clucking filling the yard with a sound that made the place feel alive again. Together they dug new post holes deep and tamped the earth firm. Together they carried boards and framed new steps. She sanded the door smooth, fitted the lock he had bought with his wages. Piece by piece, the cabin grew stronger, not the image of something barely holding, but of something cared for. Each evening they carved out small rituals. She stirred oats thin but warm. He brought back flour when wages allowed. She set the lamp low. He checked the rails once more before dark. They carved their initials on the inside edge of the door, small, private, hidden from gossip. At dusk they walked the fence side by side, marking posts, watching the horizon. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer sharp, no longer just endurance. It was acceptance, a way of saying, without words, I'll stand where you stand. Late one evening, after hands raw from work and the lamp burning low, she finally spoke of what had been locked in her throat for months. He came with soft talk, she said, meaning her husband, her eyes fixed on the wall instead of him. Told me we'd have land worth keeping. But it wasn't the land he wanted, only the bottle. Sold the last quart of wood one winter for whiskey. Left me with a dead stove and bruises to carry to the pump next morning. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself on. When he vanished, he left more than debts. Left his name tied to mine. Every time men came waving paper, they told me I didn't own what I was standing on. The cowboy sat forward, elbows on his knees, listening without a shift of face. She was grateful for that. Pity would have cut deeper than silence. When the quiet stretched, he spoke in turn, voice low. My debts are to a foreman back in New Mexico. Loaned me a horse after mine was shot out from under me. Said I'd square it after the cattle drive. But the drive ended in a fight. Not mine to start, but mine to finish. Sheriff ran me out before I could pay what I owed. Been moving since. He looked down at his hands, scars catching the lamplight. My brother's buried under a ridge with no name. I keep moving because standing still makes me remember too much. She studied him then. Really studied him. Not the drifter she first thought. Not another man waiting to take what wasn't his. Just someone carrying weight the same as her. Different shapes, same burden. Something in her chest eased, though fear still whispered. Trust had burned her before. But that night, As the lamp guttered low and he sat steady across from her, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this time was different. The next week passed without riders on the trail, but quiet didn't mean safety. Each morning she braced for hooves or fists on the door. He noticed how her eyes swept the horizon, how she checked the latch twice. He didn't press her. He only worked harder, steadying the cabin one job at a time. By the fourth day, clouds gathered again, heavy but not as fierce as the last storm. Still, he climbed to the roof to hammer loose tin while she shifted jars low. Together they moved with the ease of those who had already survived one storm side by side. When the rain eased, she stepped onto the porch and found herself looking at the cabin, not as a curse but as a promise. The walls stood firmer, the window panes caught light without rattling, the fence rails lined straight. For the first time, she thought maybe it wasn't just a place she was clinging to. Maybe it could be home again. That night, she lingered longer by the table, folding her arms against her chest as she watched him set his coat across her shoulders without a word. She didn't shrug it off this time. She let it stay. She leaned closer, forehead resting briefly against his chest, breath catching with the weight of everything unspoken. He didn't press closer, didn't reach for more. His restraint told her what kind of man he was better than any vow could. The lamp burned warm against the patched walls. For the first time since her husband had vanished, she lay down without a rifle by her bed, and he rolled his blanket out not on the porch but under the same roof. The Wild West remained harsh, unforgiving. Men like Rollins would always ride somewhere. Storms would always break over ridges, and dust would always crawl across the flats. But inside that cabin, the story had shifted. What began with suspicion at a pump had become something steadier, something she hadn't dared believe she might hold again. Not just survival, but the chance to live without being alone. And as dawn stretched pale over the ridge, two weary souls, one woman who refused to be chased away, and one drifter too tired to keep moving, stood side by side on ground they could finally call theirs.